There are lots of great heroes of the faith in the Bible, but one towers above the others in his ability to trust and obey God. Can you imagine leaving your homeland and starting your life over at the ripe old age of 75? Can you imagine still trusting that God would give you numerous descendants, even when you're old and childless? And can you imagine being finally blessed with a son after a lifetime of waiting, then being asked to give him up and offer him back to God? Let's look at the extraordinary life and faith of our father Abraham. Shalom and welcome to God's Story, Our Story, Catholics for Israel's online Bible course. I'm Dr. Andre Villeneuve. Last time we saw how God decreated humanity with a devastating flood. Then he recreated it by making a covenant with Noah and his sons. We also saw how the nations rebelled against God at Babel, so that he confused their language and scattered them across the earth. Today, we turn from scattering to ingathering. We see how the heroic faith, trust, and obedience of one man not only reversed the disobedience of Adam, but also founded a new family of God, a people who would become the agent of God's promises and blessings to the entire world. Follow me as we walk together with the father of our faith, Avraham Avinu, our father Abraham. Please remember to like this video, subscribe to our channel, click the notification bell, and post your questions and comments below. Our father Abraham, father of the faith, Genesis 12 to 25. Last time we covered the generations from Noah to Terah, and we saw how the human life expectancy started to decrease quite radically after the flood, going from the extremely long lifespans of the early patriarchs from Adam to Noah, but then after the flood, a dramatic decrease so that by the time we get to Terah and Abraham, their lifespans are beginning to approach the lifespans that we know today. We also looked at the genealogy of Noah and then of Shem, and we saw how the line between Noah and Terah, so 10 generations leading to the three sons of Terah, Abram, Nahor, and Haran, in many ways reflects the initial genealogy going from Adam to Noah, so also 10 generations leading down to Noah, who has three sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth. Looking at the family tree of Noah's descendants, we see a bit of a bird's eye view of most of the main characters of the rest of the book of Genesis. So here we have Noah's three sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth. Here's your line of Shem going down to Terah. Terah's three sons, Abram, Nahor, and Haran. Haran's going to be the father of Lot and Milcah. Lot is the father of Moab and Ammon, two of Israel's traditional future enemies. And Milcah will marry Nahor, and he will be the father of Bethuel, who is the father of Rebekah, who will marry Isaac. Abraham, of course, will be the father of Ishmael, and then of Isaac, who is the father of Jacob and Esau. So we see the major cast of characters right here in this family tree of most of the major people we're going to encounter later in the book of Genesis. We have now reached our third covenant in salvation history, the covenant with Abraham. We began with Adam, who was husband of a marriage, and the sign of the first covenant was the Sabbath. Then we had Noah, who was father of a household, and the sign of that covenant was the rainbow. Now, as we will see, Abraham will be chieftain of a tribe, and the sign of that covenant will be circumcision. And so God promised Abraham the promised land, where his natural descendants might be blessed as a nation, and then a kingdom, until all the families of the earth would be blessed through him and his seed. And that is what we are going to unpack as we look at the life and story of Abraham. This man initially, of course, is called Abram, and the covenant with this man begins with a command coming from God. Go from your country and your kindred and your father's house to the land that I will show you. God asks Abram at the ripe old age of 75 to leave his homeland and go to this faraway land of Canaan from his original Ur. We know he made a stop up here in Haran, and then he's going to go down and settle in this unknown land of Canaan. So what a step in faith for this man who is not by any means young anymore to start over his life and move to this new land. Along with the commandment to go, God makes 3 promises to Abram. What are these 3 promises? Let's read Genesis 12, verses 2 and 3. I will make of you a great nation, and I will bless you, and make your name great, so that you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and the one who curses you I will curse. And in you all the families of the earth will be blessed. So what are these 3 promises? Number 1, I will make of you a great nation. And obviously for someone's descendants to become a great nation, they're going to need a land as well. We're going to see God make an explicit promise of this land in the coming chapters. Second, God says, I will make your name great. Now, what does it mean in the ancient Near East to make someone's name great? Well, it points to the fact that this person's name is going to be well known, and also this person's descendants will reach a position of posterity and power. So when we talk about making someone's name great, we're talking about the political power of a dynasty or kingdom, and that is the second promise to Abram. The third promise, in you all the families of the earth shall be blessed. And so that points to not just a national blessing of Abraham's own family and descendants, but a worldwide blessing that's going to affect the entire world. So a lot is there in those first 3 verses of Genesis chapter 12. Abram then sets out on his journey to Canaan, which is described very briefly in verses 4 and 5. He arrives in Shechem, and there he builds an altar where he worships God. It's a sign of his trust and dedication in God, even though he has no idea what God is doing at this point. He then goes south between Bethel and Ai, and there he builds another altar to also worship God. Now, if you pay attention to these cities, especially Bethel and Ai, you're going to recognize cities that become very important later in Israelite history, namely at the time of Joshua, when Joshua will conquer the land of Canaan. And so scholars have noted here that this looks like a symbolic conquest of Canaan. It's as if Abram, so to speak, plants his flag to claim these areas as he erects altars and prays to God from these places, which will be central in the later conquest of the land. But it seems that Abram has barely arrived in Canaan that a famine breaks out and he must flee. He must go down to Egypt to survive and to find some food. But there he is concerned that his wife Sarai, despite being 65 years old, she's still so beautiful that she's going to attract too much attention on the part of the Egyptians. And so he is concerned about his life. He is concerned that they might kill him in order to take his wife for themselves. And so he asks Sarai to say that she is his sister, and indeed that's going to spare him. Nevertheless, Sarai is taken into Pharaoh's house, and that's going to lead to the unleashing of plagues upon Pharaoh's house, so that Pharaoh will be completely confounded, and he's going to return Sarai to Abram and tell them to go away, to go back to their land. Of course, anyone who is familiar with the story of the Bible is going to recognize something here. For the family of God to be taken into Pharaoh's house in Egypt, to be somehow enslaved, and that's going to lead to the unleashing of plagues upon Pharaoh's house and to their release and going back out of Egypt into the promised land. You've guessed right. This is an anticipation of the future Exodus. It's as if Sarai here is anticipating the role of Israel, prefiguring the future role of Israel as enslaved and released by another Pharaoh in Egypt because of the plagues that are going to afflict that future Pharaoh. And so it's as if Abram here is playing the role of God as interceding and mediating for the release of Sarai. So we're going to see in the life of Abram a lot of hints that point to the future history of his descendants, of the people of Israel who are not yet born at this point. By the time Abram returns to Canaan with Sarai, they go to Bethel, but there is a dispute between Abram and his nephew Lot over the possession of the land. So the herdsmen of Abram and the herdsmen of Lot have this dispute because there is apparently not enough land for both of them. So Abram tells Lot, well, you choose. Where do you want to go? And what part of the land do you want to take for yourself? Lot chooses the Jordan Valley, which ominously is the place of Sodom and Gomorrah. And we're told here that the men of Sodom were very wicked. Abram chooses to dwell in Canaan by default instead of going down to the Jordan Valley. As he settles in Canaan, God promises to Abram that this land of Canaan will be an everlasting possession for him and for his descendants. It's the first of many times when God will make that promise to Abram and then later to his son and grandson. So we know that the covenant with Abram is inseparable from this promise of the land of Canaan to him and to his descendants. Abram dwells in Hebron. He builds yet another altar, another flag post, basically claiming the future land for himself and for his descendants according to God's promises. Here we see a bit of Abram's journeys, and so he arrives from the north, here from Haran, settles in Shechem, then between Bethel and Ai, goes down to Egypt, and then comes back over here and dwells in Hebron, which is down here just south of Jerusalem today. So a lot of wanderings in Canaan and even outside of Canaan for Abram, who it seems has just barely arrived. In chapter 14 of Genesis, there's an international incident. We see a battle between foreign kings, 4 of the Canaanite kings against 5 of them. And Abram is caught in the midst of this because Lot is captured by some of the hostile kings. So Abram proves his worth and his courage as he puts together an expedition and goes after them by night and is able to release Lot so that Lot is able to go back home. And after this battle, we meet this mysterious figure who is called Melchizedek. In Hebrew, this means the king of righteousness. We're told that this is the king of Salem, Salem which later will become Jerusalem, and the priest of God the Most High. And he brings bread and wine to Abram and his men and blesses Abram. And then Abram gives him a tithe of everything he owns, so the 10th of everything that he owns. Now, this is a really interesting figure. Who is this Melchizedek? According to Jewish tradition, this is none other than Shem, the son of Noah, who at this point is a venerable patriarch. And what is he doing with Abram? What is this strange blessing, this strange ritual, and this giving of bread and wine in exchange for the tithes? Well, some of the rabbis say it's basically Melchizedek forming or training Abram in the priesthood, because Abram will have to carry out a priestly role. He's already built some altars and offered sacrifices, but we know that he will have to offer an ultimate sacrifice nearer to the end of his life. Also in Christian tradition, Melchizedek is of course a type of Christ. The Epistle to the Hebrews discusses this at length, and this means that the offering of bread and wine becomes a foreshadow of the Eucharist. This bloodless offering of bread and wine that anticipates the Eucharist in sacred Christian tradition. As we continue through the Abrahamic narrative, we're going to see these 3 promises that God made to Abram in chapter 12 elevated to covenants, and we're going to see this happen in chapters 15, 17, and 22. First, in chapter 15, we're going to see the first promise of a land and nation elevated to a covenant with the so-called covenant between the pieces. Then, in chapter 17, we're going to see the promise of a great name, that is, of a kingdom or a future political dynasty, elevated to a covenant by the covenant of circumcision, and when Abram is renamed Abraham. Thirdly, we're going to see the promise of a worldwide blessing in chapter 22, where God will make a solemn oath to Abraham after he is willing to offer up his own son, Isaac. So this is what we're going to unpack now. We are in Genesis 15. This is when God's first promise of a land and nation are raised to the level of covenant. God speaks to Abram and he promises that his offspring will be as numerous as the stars of heaven. Unsurprisingly, Abram is a little bit skeptical about this. He has no son. His own heir is just a servant in his house, Eliezer. And nevertheless, here's the Lord's promise. Look now towards heaven and count the stars if you are able to number them. And he said to him, so shall your descendants be. And Abram believed in the Lord, and he accounted it to him for righteousness. So despite the odds, even though there was no evidence at all for any kind of fulfillment of these promises in Abram and Sarai's barrenness, Abram believed the Lord's promises, and this was accounted to him as righteousness. So how is that going to go about? Well, God seals his promise with a solemn oath enacted in a sacrificial ritual. So he promises the land to Abram with the cutting of these animals. He asks him to take a number of animals, to cut them in two, and then to walk in between the parts of these animals. And the Lord begins this covenant by saying, I am the Lord who brought you out of Ur of the Chaldeans to give you this land to inherit it. If you pay attention, you're going to recognize very much this language of God also speaking much later at Mount Sinai when he says to Israel and to Moses, I am the Lord your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt. And so now he's talking to Abram, whom he has delivered from idolatry and brought to this land for the sake of blessing the world. But as this covenant is formed, Abram falls into a deep sleep and he has a dream. And what does he see? His descendants will be slaves in a foreign land for 400 years. Well, that does not sound like a promise of blessing upon himself, his descendants, and the whole world. It sounds like a terrible time of affliction. And indeed it is. So Abram has a vision here of the future slavery of his people in Egypt. And as the confirmation that this is going to come to pass, he sees this burning torch passing between the animal pieces, which becomes the sign of God's covenant oath. So Abram is very much a prophet here in how he sees the future of his people, but how God will deliver them and bring them back to this land which he has now promised to Abram. Abram has now received these promises, and he's a little bit in a hurry. So at the instigation of his wife Sarai, they think, well, maybe we should take a shortcut to have our offspring. So even though Sarai is barren, she asks Abram to bear her a son through her Egyptian maid Hagar. And this is not unprecedented in the ancient Near East. This happened when a woman was barren, that she would give her maid to her husband so that he would beget children through her maid, and then the children would be considered as the children of the woman, not of the maid. And this indeed works. The maid Hagar conceives, but this leads to a rivalry between her and her mistress Sarai, so that she despises Sarai, and there is bad vibes between the two of them. And so Sarai, who is the one in power here, deals very harshly with Hagar, and Hagar is forced to flee into the desert. There, God sends an angel to protect her, and God promises descendants through her son, through the son of Hagar, who will be in continual conflict with his brethren. And so we see a bit of an ominous promise here. God protects Hagar. He also promises that descendants will come from her, but there will be a history of conflict between this son to come of Hagar and any other brethren who are still to come, other sons of Abraham. When Abram is 86, Hagar bears him Ishmael, and he will become known as the father of the Arabs. And you already see where this is going here, the father of the Arabs, and Isaac, who is not yet conceived, will be the father of the Hebrews or Jewish people. And we still see this conflict going on today between Arabs and Jews. We come to chapter 17, where God shows up once again and has something to say to Abram. What does he do here? He elevates his second promise to Abram to make his name great to that of a covenant. So we see the initial promise here in Genesis 12:2, I will make your name great. And for the sake of underlining this, first he changes Abram's name to Abraham. In Hebrew, it's just adding one letter, the letter He, so that Abram, exalted father, now becomes father of a multitude. Of course, prophetic in terms of anticipating the blessing that will come out of now Abraham. And so God reiterates and expands his promise that nations, but not only nations, but also kings will come forth from the seed of Abraham. And so nations, kings, and a land will be given to Abraham's descendants. Here is the promise. As for me, behold, my covenant is with you, and you shall be a father of many nations. No longer shall your name be called Abram, but your name shall be Abraham. For I have made you a father of many nations. I will make you exceedingly fruitful, and I will make nations of you, and kings shall come from you. And I will establish my covenant between me and you and your descendants after you in their generations, for an everlasting covenant, to be God to you and your descendants after you. Also I give to you and your descendants after you the land in which you are a stranger, all the land of Canaan, as an everlasting possession, and I will be their God. You see how these promises are really unconditional. the land of Canaan as an everlasting possession to Abraham and his descendants. Now we know that the possession of the land at some point will become conditional upon their faithfulness, but the initial promise is really unconditional. In other words, God for sure will keep his promises, and this land will belong to his descendants forever. But there's a catch. This covenant is going to come at a price. And what will be the sign of this covenant? Abraham shows up and gathers his men and tells them, I have good news and bad news. God's going to make this covenant with us. We're going to have numerous descendants, and kings will come from us, and we will have this land forever. But we need to perform a little surgery in the meantime as a sign of this covenant. And so every male child must be circumcised on the 8th day. Some say that this is a type of consequence for his shortcut that he tried to take with Hagar. And we know the covenant will pass through the seed of Abraham. From the very beginning, since the Garden of Eden, God promised that the seed of the woman would win this victory against the seed of the serpent. And so this seed went through Eve, through Seth, and then down the line of Seth through Noah and Shem down to Terah, and now Abraham. And so that's why the covenant has to be made by means of circumcision. And this is a very serious obligation because any male who is not circumcised is to be cut off from his people. Still in chapter 17, God also changes Sarai's name to Sarah. Sarai means my princess, and Sarah just means princess. And so Sarai is no longer just Abraham's princess, but she will be a princess to all now because she will become the mother of a great nation. And so God promises that she will bear Abraham a son. Now, old Abraham finds this very funny and he laughs. And God retorts that, oh, because you have laughed, your son will be called Yitzchak, which means in Hebrew, he laughs, and the covenant will be given to him. All males are circumcised. They need some time of recovery, but this basically seals this covenant that God makes with Abraham and his future descendants. As we come to chapter 18 of Genesis, a very interesting encounter and dialogue between Abraham and 3 men who appear before Abraham's tent. It seems that Abraham is recovering from his circumcision surgery. And who are these 3 men? If you look at the text very closely, he seems to be speaking to 3 men, but at the same time, he's speaking to the Lord. So it's not clear if he's speaking to humans or if he's speaking to God. So here we have the beginning of chapter 18. Then the Lord appeared to him by the terebinth trees of Mamre, as he was sitting in the tent door in the heat of the day. So he lifted his eyes and looked, and behold, 3 men were standing by him. So it seems that these 3 men who somehow represent the Lord, later we're going to see the 3 men depart, but only 2 will arrive in Sodom, while Abraham remains to talk to the Lord. So it seems that one of the men somehow was the angel of the Lord, or some have said a type of pre-incarnate Christ who remains there to speak with Abraham. In any case, it seems like Abraham is talking with the Lord and 2 angels. And in the midst of this conversation, the Lord announces once again that Sarah will bear a son. And now Sarah is the one who overhears this, and now it's her turn to laugh at this apparently absurd promise. At her age, she's been barren for a long time. How will she bear a son? And once again, this confirms the fact that their son will be called, he laughs, Isaac, Yitzchak. Following this conversation, Abraham remains with the Lord, and this is where the Lord announces to Abraham that judgment is coming upon the wicked cities of Sodom and Gomorrah. And now Abraham reveals his role as an intercessor. He mediates and barters with God and tries to appeal to the Lord's mercy, saying, will you really destroy a city if there are 50 righteous people in it? And then he bargains it down to 40 and to 30 to 20 and even down to 10, so that every time the Lord says, if there are 50 righteous people, I will not destroy the city. If there are 40 righteous, I will not destroy it, and so on, until he even agrees that if there are even 10 righteous people in the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah, he will not destroy them. And we know that in the end, he did destroy the cities. So Abraham really shows his role as an intercessor, and it also points to the mercy of God, who is willing to spare wicked cities, even if there are just a few righteous within them. We come to chapter 19, where Lot is in Sodom, and he welcomes these 2 angels who are still appearing as men. And the men of Sodom, we see their wickedness in that they want to abuse the visitors, apparently sexually. They say, bring out these men that you have received so that we may know them. And we know that to know in the Bible points to sexual encounter, not just to know intellectually. And so there's some drama here. Lot is even willing to put his 2 daughters outside instead of the 2 guests so that he would not violate the laws of hospitality, which were sacrosanct in the ancient Near East. So Lot's own character is a little bit questionable here in how he reacts to this crisis. In the end, it's the 2 angels who really take action, and so they take Lot and his family out of Sodom, tell them to flee because the city will be destroyed. And indeed it is. Fire and brimstone fall from the heavens, and despite the warning not to turn back, Lot's wife turns back and is turned into a pillar of salt. And we know this is in the Dead Sea area today, which is extremely saline, full of minerals, and you can still go there and see many pillars of salt. So if you go to the Dead Sea, maybe you'll run into Lot's wife. Lot and his family, or at least Lot and his daughters, are saved. All the others are destroyed in Sodom. But following this act of divine initiative and divine salvation, once again we see human failure. So what's going on here? The 2 daughters of Lot, apparently they thought that the whole world had been destroyed, kind of like in the time of the flood. And so they have this shocking idea in order to have progeny, in order to have children, they decide to sleep with their own father. And so they have relations with Lot. And through this ancestral union, the 2 sons of Moab and Ammon are born. And we know that Moab and Ammon will also be kind of perpetual enemies in the future history of Israel. We are in chapter 20 of Genesis. Abraham goes to Gerar, and there he is again concerned about the beauty of Sarah, that Sarah will attract too much attention. So he pulls an old trick out of his hat and says that Sarah is his sister and not his wife. Abimelech is a righteous man, and so he does not touch Sarah, and eventually he sends them back home. In chapter 21, finally a son is born to Sarah, and as the Lord had anticipated and prophesied, they were going to name this son Isaac. So it's his birth and his circumcision. He is immediately integrated into the covenant. And for a second time, Sarah asked Abraham to cast out Hagar and Ishmael. There's apparently the beginning of a rivalry here between the 2 sons, between Ishmael and Isaac. And so God allows it that Ishmael be cast out with Hagar. Once again, God takes care of Hagar and now of Ishmael. In the wilderness, he provides for them, and he speaks to her and promises once again to make of Ishmael a great nation. And as we saw, the rivalry between those 2 sons will later become this rivalry between Jews and Arabs up to this very day. Abram then makes a covenant with Abimelech in Beersheba, so there's a good relationship between the 2 of them, and eventually Abraham will return to Canaan. Now Abraham finally has his son of the promise. It seems like he can now die in peace, but no, not quite. Abraham's final test is about to occur, and guess what he's going to be asked to sacrifice, to offer up back to God, the very son of the promise for whom he has waited all his life. So God appears to Abraham and says, Abraham, take now your son, your only son Isaac, whom you love, and go to the land of Moriah and offer him there as a burnt offering. What a test upon the old patriarch, asking him to offer Isaac, his beloved Isaac, as a burnt offering on this hill of Mount Moriah. We are told about the journey to Moriah, and we're told that Isaac himself is the one who carries the wood for the offering. And Isaac is a bit perplexed. He asks Abram, Father, we have the fire, the knife, but where is the lamb for the offering? And Abraham answers prophetically, saying, God himself will provide the lamb, my son. As they arrived to Mount Moriah, they came to the place of which God had told him. And Abraham built an altar there and placed the wood in order. And he bound Isaac his son and laid him on the altar upon the wood. And Abraham stretched out his hand and took the knife to slay his son. But the angel of the Lord called to him from heaven and said, Abraham, Abraham. So he said, Here I am. And he said, Do not lay your hand on the lad, or do anything to him. For now I know that you fear God, since you have not withheld your son, your only son, from me. This is known in Hebrew as the Akedah, which means binding, the binding of Isaac. What could have gone through Abraham's mind at that point? Thinking that, here we go, all the promises, I've waited for this son all my life, and I love my son, and now God is asking me to offer him back to him. But Abraham remained silent and obedient throughout this whole ordeal. God had provided a lamb, but in the end, we don't find a lamb. We're told that Abraham saw nearby a ram who was caught in a thicket, and so he takes this ram and offers this ram for a burnt offering in place of his son. And then Abraham calls the place Adonai Yireh in Hebrew, the Lord will provide. Much later in the New Testament, in the Epistle to the Hebrews, we are told that by faith Abraham, when he was tested, offered up Isaac, and he who had received the promises offered up his only begotten son, concluding that God was able to raise him up even from the dead. So the Epistle to the Hebrews attributes quite a remarkable faith to Abraham here. Why was he willing to offer his son? Because he quietly believed that God could raise him up from the dead. One of the consequences of this extraordinary act of self-sacrifice on the part of Abraham, well, because of his obedience, God swears an oath to bless all nations through his seed. And so here is the third promise, the promise that Abraham's seed will become a worldwide blessing, and it is now released through his obedience and his willingness to sacrifice Isaac. Look at the words of the Lord here, this solemn oath that he makes following the Akedah. By myself I have sworn, says the Lord, because you have done this thing and have not withheld your son, your only son. Blessing, I will bless you, and multiplying, I will multiply your descendants as the stars of the heaven, and as the sand which is on the seashore. And your descendants shall possess the gate of their enemies. In your seed all the nations of the earth shall be blessed, because you have obeyed my voice. You see the power of Abraham's sacrifice of his son. What does this do in addition to releasing this divine blessing upon Abraham's descendants and upon the world? Well, Abraham's obedience in many ways reverses Adam's disobedience. We know that sin came into the world because Adam refused to obey the Lord's commandment, and now the blessing is released into the world because Abraham believed the Lord's commandment and obeyed him, even if it required tremendous sacrifice. So the blessing that God swears to Abraham reverses the curses triggered when Adam disobeyed the covenant. What roles does Abraham play in his life? You can begin to anticipate what's coming. And so in the Abrahamic covenant, we see Abraham who receives prophetic visions, and he is called a prophet in Genesis 20, verse 7, a prophet who conveys the word of truth that the Lord has revealed to him. He also builds altars and offers sacrifices, and that would make Abraham a priest. Most notably, he offers his own son on this altar in Genesis 22. So Abraham is a prophet, a priest, and also by the very fact that he keeps all of the Lord's commandments and statutes and ordinances, this makes him a type of king who follows the way that the Lord has set before him. This is where he proves his faithfulness through his obedience. And so we see Abraham in his threefold role of prophet, priest, and king, who restores a little bit more of the truth, the life, and the way that Adam and Eve had lost in the Garden of Eden. So these three promises are elevated to covenants. When will they be fulfilled later in salvation history? So we will see indeed that the three covenants will be fulfilled in the next three periods of salvation history. First, the great nation that was elevated to a covenant in Genesis 15, we'll see that Abram's seed received its national land and boundaries after the Exodus, and that's going to be during the Mosaic covenant. Then the promise to make Abram's seed a great name, which was elevated to a covenant in Genesis 17, Abraham's seed will become a kingdom after the conquest of the promised land, and that's going to occur under the Davidic covenant. Thirdly, the worldwide blessing, which was elevated to a covenant in Genesis 22, the seed of Abraham became the source of blessing for the entire world with Christ's incarnation and his institution of the new covenant. So here is in a nutshell the threefold blessing to Abraham promised by God. 3 promises in Genesis 12, verses 2 to 3, nationhood, neighbor, dynasty, and worldwide blessing, elevated to covenants in Genesis 15, 17, and 22, and then fulfilled under the Mosaic covenant, under the Davidic covenant, and under the new covenant. So as you can see, pretty much all of salvation history is found here in a nutshell in this Abrahamic narrative. And how will it all be fulfilled? Didn't the Lord say the Lord would provide a lamb? Indeed, the Lord will provide a lamb, but much later. As we read in the Epistle to the Galatians, St. Paul writes, Christ has redeemed us from the curse of the law, having become a curse for us, that the blessing of Abraham might come upon the Gentiles in Christ Jesus, that we might receive the promise of the Spirit through faith. So just as Abraham was a righteous and faithful father, we're going to see that God himself is a righteous and faithful father. Abraham offered his only begotten son, Isaac, on Mount Moriah. Much later, God will offer his only son, Jesus, on Calvary, which is one of the hills of Mount Moriah. Abraham trusted that God himself would provide the lamb for a burnt offering. Much later, the Lord himself provided the lamb, Jesus, the Lamb of God, who takes away the sins of the world. Isaac carried the wood for his own self-offering to the top of the hill, whereas Jesus also carried the wood of the cross to the top of Calvary. On the 3rd day, Abraham gets his son back, and on the 3rd day, Jesus is raised from the dead. God swears to bless all nations through Abraham's seed, and Jesus later will be the Father's blessing to all nations. So we see that indeed God provided the lamb just as he had promised. With Genesis 22, this is obviously the climax of Abraham's life, but he still has something he needs to do before he passes away and goes back to God. First, his beloved wife Sarah dies. She dies in Kiryat Arba, which is close to Hebron, at the beginning of Genesis 23, and Abraham negotiates with Ephron the Hittite to buy a piece of land and the cave of Machpelah, where he will be able to bury his wife. So what is Abraham doing here by this purchase of land? He's essentially securing the first promise by acquiring land in the land of Canaan. This gives him a little foothold in the fulfillment of the promise of a great nation and of a land that will be given to his descendants. Then in the lengthy chapter 24, we see that Abraham is very concerned about finding a bride for his son Isaac. Of course, if his name is to become great, if he is to become a royal dynasty, he also needs to secure progeny to his son. And so Abraham sends his servant back to Ur to find a wife for Isaac. God leads him to Rebekah, whom he meets at a well, and this beautiful Rebekah happens to be Abraham's niece. And so he also meets Rebekah's brother and father, and they negotiate. And so Bethuel and Laban negotiate with Abraham's servant, and in the end they offer Rebekah to him as Isaac's wife. And so he is able to take Rebekah back to Canaan, and there Rebekah becomes Isaac's wife. So this secures the second promise that Abraham's seed will become a great name by making sure that Isaac is married and will also have children. Abraham, to our surprise, marries again with a woman called Keturah, and he has other children by her. But finally, at the ripe old age of 175, Abraham dies and is buried. And immediately after his death, we are told that God blesses Isaac. And here we see the blessing of Abraham that is passed on to Isaac personally by God, so that Isaac will now be the conduit and the channel of the divine blessing that will further God's plan of salvation. Finally, we're told about the generations of Ishmael, and this sets us up for the generations of Isaac that will follow in the next section. As we conclude this unit looking at the life of Abraham, we turn again to the Epistle to the Hebrews that draws some lessons that we can learn from the life of this great patriarch. And so the Epistle to the Hebrews says, "By faith Abraham obeyed when he was called to go out to the place which he would receive as an inheritance. And he went out, not knowing where he was going. By faith he dwelt in the land of promise as in a foreign country, dwelling in tents with Isaac and Jacob, the heirs with him of the same promise. for he waited for the city which has foundations, whose builder and maker is God. So Abraham's obedience, walking in faith, not seeing the promises fulfilled in his own lifetime, but still he had great confidence that God would be faithful to his promises. So the question to us, are we willing to leave our comfort zone and move on to the place where God is calling us? Let us be inspired by Abraham's obedience of faith. We just saw how God promised that he would make of Abraham a great nation, a great name, and a blessing to all the peoples of the earth. Next time, we will complete the book of Genesis. We'll see how Abraham's family begins to grow through the adventures of his son Isaac and his grandson Jacob. We'll focus especially on the roller coaster of Jacob's life, the man who would become the father of the people of Israel, but not before living through a lot of family drama and ending his days in Egypt. Please remember to like this video, subscribe to our channel, click the notification bell, and post your questions and comments below. I will see you next time. Shalom and God bless.